Disclaimer. I'm speaking today as an individual and not on behalf of the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, which I'm a founding member, nor for the United States government, of which the Asia Pacific is an organization. And actually, I'm here more to learn about climate science and policy in Bangladesh than I am to teach. But I thought it would be a good idea to try and provide a broader background and a regional consideration, which might provide something of a context within which you folks who are more expert in climate change in Bangladesh than I might work. This is an outline of my presentation. I'm going to start with the science briefly, because I think most of you are familiar with it. Then we'll talk a bit about the environmental impacts of climate change. Move from environmental impacts to human security, and from human security to some of the state security dimensions of climate change in the Asia-Pacific region. And then we'll bring it to an end with observations and conclusions. Global warming is a fact. There's no question about it. It's based on observation. The graph provided here gives a 12-month running mean indication of the temperature anomalies between 1880 and the year 2000. And as you can see, during that period, the average global land temperature index of the planet has increased by approximately 1 degree centigrade. So if global warming is a fact, then what is climate change? Climate change is a theory that seeks to explain the observations based on three parts. One part is our scientific knowledge of the greenhouse effect. The second are actual measured increases in atmospheric greenhouse gases. And the third is computer simulation models of greenhouse gas emissions and their impact on future climate. The greenhouse effect, if anyone's not familiar with it, essentially is this. The solar radiation from the sun is the source of all energy for the planet Earth, aside from a little nuclear radiation left over from radioactive elements in the core. Now, this isn't working all that well. The radiation comes through the atmosphere and warms the Earth, okay, where some of that radiation is converted from visible and ultraviolet light into infrared radiation, infrared light, and that then escapes the planet and radiates back into outer space. Okay? The amount of that re-radiation, of the infrared radiation, depends upon the composition of the atmosphere. Okay? And the greenhouse effect is named so because it works like a greenhouse, where you put glass in front of the area that you want to keep warm. The glass lets the transparent visible light through, it blocks the infrared light going out, and the greenhouse is warm, and that's how the atmosphere works. And the more greenhouse gases that you put into the atmosphere, the larger the effect. And so global warming, according to the climate change theory, is due primarily to this greenhouse gas effect. And what's more, this is also backed up by observation, in that the measured amount or proportion of carbon dioxide, which is principal greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, has observably risen between 1960 and 2010, increasing from 320 parts per million to 380, as measured in my home state of Hawaii at the top of the mountain Mauna Loa. Okay. Based upon this kind of data and this kind of information, climate scientists use computer models to attempt to predict what may happen under a variety of scenarios. The lines on this graph are taken from the fourth IPCC assessment report that was issued in 2007. One interesting thing to come out of that is this. All of the different models, which tend to look at worst case, best case, middle case, all the different models are fairly close together in their predictions for what may happen between now and the year 2030, okay, over the next roughly 20 years. But once you get out beyond that, once you get toward the end of this century, for example, those models diverge rather greatly, so that a difference of something on the order of 0.5 degree centigrade, 1 degree Fahrenheit, between the model predictions for the next 20 years, but a difference of something on the order of 3 degrees centigrade or about 6 degrees Fahrenheit for the predictions of the out year. And that could have very extreme consequences if we come toward the higher element of that. I'd just like to point out that the IPCC is an international one, and that scientists from around the world, including all the countries in the Asia-Pacific region, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, are participating in that report, including 4 from Bangladesh working on the IPCC 5 report. Okay, so that's a real quick overview of what the science behind climate change is. Let's move from climate science to environmental science. What's the impact of climate change? Well, global warming causes environmental change through higher ocean temperatures, higher land temperatures, and higher air temperatures. And in turn, the consequences of these are more heat energy in the atmosphere, which feeds tropical cyclones. The greater amount of evaporation to the greater temperature leads to more precipitation. In fact, 2010, the year just passed, had more precipitation worldwide than has ever been measured before. And it's also tied for the hottest year worldwide that's ever been measured. In addition, there's a potential rise in sea level, an observed rise in sea level from thermal expansion of ocean water. Up until now, the rise in sea level due to melting of ice in the polar caps is negligible. It hasn't really occurred yet. It appears that it is occurring, especially in Greenland, but it hasn't really started yet. The observed sea rise that we've seen, which amounts to about 1 millimeter a year over the last 20 or 30 years, has been due to thermal expansion. What happens to a body when you heat it up? It expands. And when you heat up an ocean, it can't expand down, and it can't expand side to side, so it expands upward, thus giving the observed rises in sea level that we've seen. And it appears that this is happening faster. It appears that the rate has increased to about 3 millimeters a year over the last 5 years or so, as opposed to a rate of about 1 millimeter a year for the 20 or 30 years before that. This, of course, is a phenomenon that I understand in Bangladesh. Higher air temperatures lead to greater melting of the ice caps and glaciers, and more about that later. But they also lead to more rapid spring snowmelt in the Himalayas, for example, or in the Rocky Mountains in North America, which leads to changes in the amount and the kinds of water available for farming and agriculture in ways that have been relied upon for a very long time. And the overall tendency is for the water to come off faster, and leading to less water available later in the summer because the ice is already melted and flowed down to the ocean. And then, in addition, this leads to reduction in rainfall in some areas, even though over the planet as a whole, there's an increase in precipitation. But in particular areas, the changing in the weather patterns leads to reduced rainfall and drought. And then finally, higher ground temperatures. This is important because desertification follows when the evapotranspiration rate, that is to say the amount of water coming off the plants and the green things on the field becomes high. This can lead then to desertification as the amount of water going out of the plants in the land, out of the biota, becomes greater than the amount coming down. Plants die. Okay. And then finally, the melting of permafrost, not much of a problem in Bangladesh, but up in places like Canada, Alaska, Russia, why the ground is frozen from the top down, and thus it's called permafrost. As that permafrost melts, there can be a release of methane, which is an even stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, from the organic matter that is tied up in that permafrost, and then it gets released into the atmosphere as the permafrost melts. And indeed, this isn't just speculation. The IPCC has noted these indications of climate change happening now around the world. Retreating mountain glaciers. This picture is from your neighbors in Nepal. Rising sea levels. This shows that change in sea level overall, average since 1994 for about the last 15 years, has been on the order of 30 millimeters, 3 centimeters. And acidification of the ocean. As the proportion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, there is a balance in the carbon dioxide, a chemical balance between the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and that in the ocean. And the more that you put into the atmosphere, the more that gets released into the ocean across that air-water boundary. And when you put carbon dioxide into water, what you do is carbonic acid. Okay, and so the pH of the oceans decrease, and this is also a measured phenomenon. It's particularly important because at some certain point, the life cycle of mollusks, that is to say animals that have that limestone carbonate shell, can no longer be sustained because of the acid. The acid in the seawater can dissolve it. It also is a problem for the life cycle of certain fish. Another phenomenon is more heavy precipitation events. Severe droughts. Notice that all these photos are fairly recent. In fact, as you know, there are flooding going on right now in China, in southeastern China. More intense tropical storms, also a particular concern here. Thinning polar ice caps. This can be a concern. The projected sea level rise to the end of the century based on thermal expansion alone is probably manageable. Okay? But if the ice caps start melting, and there's evidence that the Greenland ice cap is melting, then the sea levels could rise by a matter of a meter or two. And now we're talking trouble in low-lying island nations and nations like Bangladesh and other nations in Southeast Asia that where megacities sit upon low-lying deltas like Ho Chi Minh City is another example. Okay, so there's the climate science, there's the environmental science. What then are the security implications? These next charts are taken from CARE, CARE's International Climate Change Information Center, and these projections are based on the IPCC 4 report that we've talked about. These are the areas that are at risk for drought, looking out to the years 2030 to 2040. And as you can see, significant drought hazard and extreme drought hazard, even in the area here of Bangladesh, which we think would be water-rich, and rather severe areas in your neighboring countries of India, Myanmar, and of course up in northern China and elsewhere, shown by this graph. Ironically enough, some of the same areas that are at risk of drought are also at risk of flood, as higher precipitation events rush down the rivers and cause flooding. You're right in the middle of that area of concern. And then the third area is that of cyclone risk, a well-known and familiar phenomenon. Bangladesh, which of course has led the world in many ways in adaptation to cyclone threats. And then the ocean acidification risk. These charts are a little hard to read, but they basically show an almost universal problem across the nation's oceans with respect to increased acidification, which causes threat to coral reefs. I understand there's only one coral reef in Bangladesh, but it's still not a good thing. And then the risk of sea level rise. I'm sure you're all familiar with this graphic, which shows what the impact of a 1.5 meter level of sea rise would be here in your country. Estimated total population affected could be 17 million people, and total land area affected 22,000 people. Again, I'll tell you, this is based on a scenario of an ice cap melt. But it's certainly possible. And then maybe of more immediate concern, rising food prices as a result of climate change. It's probably worth pointing out here that the risks of climate change intersect with a number of other risks that we all face globally. For example, population rise means a greater demand for food at the very time that climate change is going to impact our ability to grow certain kinds of food. At the same time, developing nations are putting greater demands on certain kinds of food, for example, meat, which requires a greater amount of grain in order to feed the animals that then go to the human table. Other possible impacts from climate change on the environment are increases in human diseases. For example, as the climate warms, malaria-carrying mosquitoes can move northward and the range of malaria increase. Climate-induced migration. If, for example, Bangladesh should lose part of its land area, then those people are going to have to live somewhere. There are some nations, as you'll see, where even the whole country may be submerged by the sea. And then the larger problems of nonlinear rate of warming. You may have heard the phrase tipping point. Okay, these represent tipping points that could happen. One is from the release of methane from permafrost. If that should happen, if significant amounts of methane are released as the ice melts and the permafrost melts in the northern areas, that's something like 25 times greater greenhouse gas impact than carbon dioxide. So it would cause even greater warming, which would cause even greater melting, which would cause even greater warming. We don't want to get into that kind of a positive feedback loop. Possibly from loss of reflectivity of melting ice. A lot of that radiation going back out of the atmosphere is reflected off the ice caps. And then as the ice caps shrink, there's less radiation being reflected by the ice, rather it's being absorbed by the rock and increasing the melting. And then from shifting ocean currents. One great concern, for example, is the Great Gulf Stream, which flows up the east coast of the United States from the Caribbean and then all the way across the Atlantic to Europe. And it keeps places like Oslo, Norway, at a livable temperature. But if that warm current should disappear or change, then Northern Europe would be much more like Siberia, like Northern Russia, than like Europe. We don't know enough about this yet. We do know that part of the generation of that current is the difference in density between salt water and fresh water. And as the ice caps melt, there's some concern that changes in the flow of these currents could occur and lead to the same kind of negative feedback loop. Okay. There are some possible positive effects, but that's for more northern areas, I'm afraid. One is the Arctic ice melts. Commerce can then use the sea routes across the northern Arctic, across Canada and Russia. There's potential for better agriculture in the northern regions of North America and Asia as the temperatures improve and become better for agriculture. And some areas that are now dry will experience better rainfall, even though there are other areas that will experience worse. Okay? So we've moved from climate science to environmental science. Now let's talk about some of the human security impacts. And here's how those connections are made. Excuse me, we've talked about the climate effects, okay, and how they can have impacts on the freshwater availability, food production, increase in natural disasters, possible disease, possible migration, which leads to the potential for conflicts over resources as resources such as freshwater become scarcer. Okay? Conflict over migration as peoples may move across borders to escape these impacts. The increased stresses on weak governments who may have to manage the impacts that we've talked about. Then there are issues of maritime boundaries. I understand that a territorial dispute between Bangladesh and India was neatly solved when the sandbar or island sticking out of the Bay of Bengal was submerged, thus changing the nature of the problem. There, that was a positive event in some areas of the world, like the Spratly Islands, where China, Philippines, and other nations are squabbling over who owns what. This could be a very explosive issue. And then exploitation by extremists, and I'll show a slide later that illustrates what I mean by that. Well, one of the big areas for conflict is that of mitigation. I'm not going to talk much about that because I think our concerns from the security sector are primarily due with adaptation and collaboration in adaptation to climate change. But as you all know, the COP meetings that have taken place in Copenhagen and in Cancun and are continuing are dealing largely with the politics of mitigation. I guess I can take some solace in the fact that China surpassed the United States as the largest emitter of greenhouse gases back in 2008. But, as the Chinese will tell you, on a per capita basis, China emits about a quarter of what the United States does. The fact is that all of this has to come down, but there's plenty of room for conflict between the developed nations on the one hand, who after all are the historical emitters of greenhouse gases, and the developing nations who are largely the victims of the emission of greenhouse gases, and where the developed nations can say, well, we're sorry, but we didn't know. We didn't know this was what was going to happen. This isn't what we were trying to do. Well, what can we do about it? So there's an area for concern as well. And I'd like to point out that globally there are probably two conceptual frameworks for looking at these issues of security and security policy based on climate change. This is taken from a recent publication called the bIPSS Asia paper series. To quote its author, Mr. Friedman, in the U.S. and Europe, it has become the accepted wisdom that climate change and national security are linked. And I'll give you some substantiating details on that in a moment. Okay? But climate change has only a marginal position in China's official security policy. Although it recognizes the urgency of the problem, the Chinese government focuses on climate change as primarily an economic question. And this difference in conception underlies much of the debate that's taken place in the meetings in Copenhagen and elsewhere, and also the positions of the states involved. And we'll see a little bit of that now, but I'd like to look at this in a somewhat different way, slicing the pie a little differently, and first look at the issues of nations with existential interests, okay, nations whose very existence depends on climate maintenance. And one of those is the Maldives, not all that far away, who, in order to illustrate the point, actually held a cabinet meeting underwater to highlight the threat of global warming. The highest point in the entire nation there is about 2 meters above sea level. So, whereas Bangladesh stands to lose 17%, they stand to lose 100% of their population. And there are other islands in the Pacific, such as Kiribati and Vanuatu, who have similar situations. But this also can lead to some political play, because in Kiribati, they're playing the China card. They went to Taiwan and asked if we get inundated, can we come there? But they did it not so much because they wanted to move to Taiwan as they saw as a way of leveraging China and Chinese interests. Then there are the interests of vulnerable nations. Maybe you would prefer to include Bangladesh as an existential threat, but there's no doubt that it's a vulnerable nation. And what we see is that these nations have begun, and indeed they become leaders, in assessing some of the security implications of climate change and adaptation to it. I'm sure you're familiar with the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan from 2008. Nepal was last year, I think, 2010, came out with their new plan. And like the Maldives, they put on a little political theater by holding a cabinet meeting up at the base of Mount Everest to illustrate the threat of melting glaciers. And then there are the interest of regional powers, which in this case are Australia and India, among others. The Prime Minister himself released India's National Action Plan on climate change, which tends to follow the Chinese model. It really looks at climate change as a development from a development perspective. Australia, on the other hand, in its first 2030 document, has begun to look at climate change as a security issue and ask the question, what are the implications for the Australian military and Australian national policy of this possible increase in national disasters and need for future humanitarian assistance. The United States did not incorporate official policy on security and climate change until last year, when the Quadrennial Defense Review for the first time recognized climate change as a problem and came to the conclusion that proactive engagement with those countries where the military is the only institution to respond to a large-scale natural disaster can help build their capability to respond to such events. And essentially, American policy is working simultaneously along two directions. One is to help countries reach sustainability, a sustainable environment, including sustainable infrastructure to help them better deal with these problems as they come up, and the other is to be prepared for increases in need for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And then there are also topics of technology transfer as well. Okay? China we've talked about. The last official documents from the Chinese Republic date to about People's Republic date to about 2002, and although they've been very active in looking at climate change issues, there really aren't any statements that I've been able to find that deal specifically with climate change and regional security out of China, which is a little bit of a surprise, although an NGO, Greenpeace China, has just published this document that deals with climate change and food security in China. So even if the government isn't publicly at least addressing these issues, some of the NGOs are. Okay. And then there are interests of other groups. Of course, Osama bin Laden is no longer with us, but in January of last year, he noted the climate change issue and said the effects of global warming have touched every continent. Drought and deserts are spreading, while from the other, I think he means on the other hand, floods and hurricanes unseen before previous decades now become frequent. People in the world, it's not right for the burden to be left on the mujahideen, an issue that causes harm to everyone. Boycott them and save yourselves, your possessions, and your children from climate change and live proud and free. So the faults and mistakes of the West and the developing nations and all of those who continue to contribute to this problem provide an opportunity for those who are its enemies to gain additional political pressure and additional political points. So it's a very complex political situation as well as being a complex scientific situation. And it's why we engage multilateral organizations. Here in South Asia, there was a SARC action plan on climate change in July 2008, not that it's led to very much action at this point. And then the Timbuktu statement on climate change in April continued that, and led in fact to a common SARC position at the Cancun meeting last year, one of the COP meetings, dealing with mitigation in this case primarily. And the public photo. ASEAN has been a little more active in this area. The head of the Environment Division of the ASEAN Secretariat last year basically stated the stark reality is that the environment cannot be separated from economic growth and social development. They each have to support and complement each other, whereas ours, the ASEAN Regional Forum, has been sounding alarm bells. Ambassador Momola was saying, for example, asking who will act on climate change warnings? Do we have the institutional mechanisms at the national, regional, and international levels to deal with these threats? And I think the answer overall is we're beginning to develop. Okay, there's a cognizance now at the level of the regional organizations. People are beginning to talk about it, and I think the talk and discussions will indeed lead to something more on the order of policy and actions. The April 2010 ASEAN leaders' statement is that on the joint response to climate change, for example, recognized the vulnerability of the region, recognized the importance of forest management. We've only talked about the emission of greenhouse gases, but as you're well aware, there's also the absorption of greenhouse gases, so reforestation can be an important part of climate change policy. So, where does that all lead us? In summary, I think we can say climate change is happening. We know that now. It was a speculation, a theory for some time, but I think it's pretty clear to say we're going to have to deal with it. Over the next 25 years, we can expect a greater incidence of storms, flooding, and regional drought, with negative impacts on the water supply, on food supplies, further erosion of seashores and island nations and coastal nations, possibly the migration of people from affected areas, which will combine with ongoing migration, for example, to urban areas from rural areas, and a possible increase in disease. But the threats of climate change have been of growing interest to Asia-Pacific policymakers and security organizations. Our scientists from our nations are engaged in climate and environmental research for mitigation. And I think we can expect in 2013 to 2014, with the fifth IPCC report, great more depth, a great more concentration on the social issues and social impacts, and also more refined projections of where those impacts will occur geographically. At least that's the amount of attention that will allow us to make more detailed comments and less general comments that we can make at the moment. And states and organizations have been dealing with adaptation issues in addition to mitigation issues since 2007 in the fourth report. Developed nations have established interagency task forces to address adaptation issues. For example, in the United States, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy oversees a climate change office that works to integrate climate change policy across defense, state, USAID, Protection Agency, National Science Foundation, and all of the agencies of government that are concerned with issues of climate change. At the same time, there's a recognized need by all nations for better scientific knowledge of the local impacts of climate change on the physical and social environments. Vulnerable nations, like Bangladesh, have special interest in adapting to environmental change through infrastructure hardening and preparedness. And adaptation, research, and planning, however, appears mostly limited to the developed nations. As I recognized earlier, Bangladesh is a notable exception to that. Adaptation has been on your agenda and your calendar for quite some time, but I'm afraid that other nations, developing nations in the Asia-Pacific region, have not reached that state of awareness. And that may indeed be an important role for Bangladesh in multilateral and bilateral relations with other nations, sharing the youth argument or even knowledge that there is a problem and a need to deal with it with their sister nations. There's a need for knowledge transfer and technical systems to the developing nations to address adaptation issues. And there's a need for knowledge transfer between science and technology communities and security practitioners at the subnational level. I don't think anything that I've presented here is new. Everything that I've presented to you is a synthesis. But when I presented it to security audiences, they say, well, we don't know the scientific community. We don't know the scientists. We don't understand the science behind it. And when I present it to scientific communities, they say, gee, we didn't know the security community was interested in this. We didn't know what they're doing. And if you get them together, as we did at a meeting in October of last year, they'll say, gee, we don't even speak each other's language. We don't work on the same time frame. We need to get together to address these problems. And then finally, I'll note that powers in the region have an interest in regional stability in the face of climate-induced natural disasters, and this provides a potential area, a real area for collaboration. I know that the United States Departments of State and Department of Defense both look at these issues as being issues for collaboration and cooperation. And finally, I'd like to note that NGOs can play an important role in framing the problems and then in linking the science and technology community on the one hand and the policy community on the other as we work to address these problems. So that's my presentation. I'd be happy to take questions that you might have, and we'd welcome your comments.
Thank you, sir.